Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Ezekiel Class. This is class number 19 today, and today we're going to do chapter 23 in Ezekiel, and this chapter is known as the two adulterous sisters, and many people call it the chapter of the two sisters. We'll see as we go through it what this is all about. We are approaching the midpoint of the book of Ezekiel. Next week we'll actually reach the midpoint. Interesting, there's two ways you can look at that. Number one is there are 48 chapters in Ezekiel, and next week we'll get to chapter 24, which is the midpoint. So physically it is the midpoint, but actually the book of Ezekiel changes focus next week, and as we get into next week we're going to see that the focus will change dramatically in what we'll be studying over the next several weeks and for the rest of the book. Up until now, what we've been studying in Ezekiel through these first 23 chapters is about God's disappointment with Israel. And we've just seen it week after week as God has explained this in different language, and each time the tenor of what he's saying is rising. We're going to hear the tenor of what God is saying today, and it's really sharp. I mean, what God is saying about Israel today and the betrayal that Israel has done to God, this is probably as sharp as it gets anywhere in the Bible. Is what you're going to hear today. We are still in the third vision that Ezekiel has gotten. Ezekiel will get 13 visions. Next week we will move to the fourth vision, but we're still in the third vision. And the situation, just to lay it all out for you again, the date is August 9th of 591 BC. That is the 10th day of the Jewish month of Av. And on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, 5 years later, so almost exactly 5 years later, Jerusalem will fall. So it's not an accident that he's out there one day into the last 5 years telling them what's going to happen. Obviously, God plans all this, and this is planned as well. So again, the language the Lord is going to use here is extremely sharp, and it reflects the extreme nature of Israel's sin. And it has been getting sharper and sharper as we've gone along, and it's going to hit its peak today as we go through this. So we're going to start with verses 1 through 4. This is an allegory. An allegory is kind of a story, kind of like Jesus told parables. God tells many things in the Bible in allegories. So this is an allegory. It's about two sisters, and it defines sisters as being daughters of the same mother, right? And he explains that their name, well, let me read it to you first. And then, so I'm going to read you verses 1 through 4. The last page of your handout is 1 through 4. If you're watching at home, by the way, welcome everyone who's watching at home. We welcome you. We pray God is blessing you out there. If you are watching at home, you may not have the last page of the notes, and the last page of the notes is from the Bible. It is chapter 23 of Ezekiel, so please open your Bibles to chapter 23 of Ezekiel. Okay, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, there were two women, daughters of the same mother. They became prostitutes in Egypt, engaged in prostitution from their youth. In that land their breasts were fondled and their virgin bosoms caressed. The older was named Oholah, and her sister was Oholibah. They were mine and gave birth to sons and daughters. Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. Okay, so God is going to tell us a story here in this chapter about two sisters, and the two sisters represent, God tells us right up front, the two sisters represent the two kingdoms of Israel that split after Solomon's death. The northern kingdom is Samaria, that was the capital of the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom is Jerusalem, that was the capital of the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, by the way, was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. So this is a story about two kingdoms, but the allegory is about two women, two sisters. So these aren't necessarily real women who ever existed. This is God telling an allegory of how he views these two daughters of his. Now when it says they are daughters of the same mother, the first question is who's the mother? And the mother is the unified state of Israel that existed up until Solomon's time. And that was, up until Solomon's time, Israel was one unified nation. And as we recall, and we've studied this before, it says in the Bible that Solomon loved many foreign women. And as a result, he had hundreds of wives. And many of these were, most of these were the daughters of kings and princes and whatever. And he would just make all these arrangements, all these alliances with these other kings in surrounding neighborhoods, where he would take their daughter in marriage, and he would then have an alliance with that king. And I guess that was good politics, but there was a problem with that. And the problem was, if you're marrying the daughter of a king, and she's a pagan, and by the way, Solomon was a Jew, how do you tell that new wife that she can't bring her idols into the palace with her? You can't. I mean, basically, you can't do that. So she comes in, she brings her, and these 700 women all come in, and they bring their idols in with them. They also bring their priests, so that they do their sacrifice and their incense, and they do all that in the palace. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over a period of years, as Solomon married all these women, he went from being, completely focused on God and on building the temple as he was initially, to having paganism going on all around him in his own palace, and having hundreds of wives who were all driving him in a pagan direction. And pretty soon he became almost a pagan himself. Not quite, but almost. And God said, when you die, I'm going to split your kingdom in half. And I'm going to let you live it out, but when you die, your sons will never inherit a kingdom that is unified. It will be split. And that's exactly what happened. When Solomon died, the kingdom split into two. So you have these two women, or these two mythical women, Oholah and Oholiba. Now, Oholah is a Hebrew word, and Oholiba is a Hebrew word. And Oholah in Hebrew means she who has a tent, or she who has a tabernacle. Remember, a tabernacle is a dwelling place, like a tent. You might remember back in the days of Moses, God dwelled in a tent in the desert. He dwelled in something called the tabernacle. So Oholah in Hebrew means she who has a tabernacle. And that is Samaria, which is the northern kingdom. And Oholiba means my tabernacle is in her, or my tent is in her, and that is Jerusalem. Now, what this means is that when the two kingdoms split, obviously only one of them could keep Jerusalem, and that was the southern kingdom, Oholiba, Jerusalem. So the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, remained in Jerusalem. The other kingdom, the one that split to the north, didn't have that. They didn't have a temple. They didn't have any place to worship. And at first they tried to let their people come down to Jerusalem, but Jeroboam, who was the king up north, realized that he was going to lose his kingdom if he kept this up very long, because the people, when they came down to Jerusalem, they realized that they really shouldn't be two nations. They really should be one nation. That's where God is, and they need to be with God. So he decided to build his own temples up there. He actually built two of them in the northern kingdom. And at first those temples were designed for God, but over time he had to create his own priests and everything else up there to do this. Over time he started to change that, and he started to put certain pagan things in there. And over time, over time they became pagan temples. So what God is saying here is that the northern kingdom has a tabernacle, but it's not mine, it's theirs. It's not God's tabernacle, it is their tabernacle. That's what's being said here. Oholiba is the southern kingdom again. They had the actual temple with the actual Ark of the Covenant in it. So my tabernacle, God's tabernacle, really is in her. God's tabernacle really is in the southern kingdom. So that's the interesting name here, the derivation of the two names, Oholah and Oholiba. Questions on that before I move on? Okay, let's move on to verse 5, and this is on the second page of your handout now. I'm going to read verses 5 through 10, and this is the story of Oholah, the northern kingdom. Oholah engaged in prostitution while she was still mine, and she lusted after her lovers, the Assyrians. Warriors clothed in blue, governors and commanders, all of them handsome young men and mounted horsemen. She gave herself as a prostitute to all the elite of the Assyrians, and defiled herself with all the idols of everyone she lusted after. She did not give up the prostitution she began in Egypt, when during her youth men slept with her, caressed her virgin bosom, and poured out their lust on her. Therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, the Assyrians, for whom she lusted. They stripped her naked, took away her sons and daughters, and killed her with the sword. She became a byword among them, and punishment was inflicted on her. Now we're going to get into something this morning. As you go through the Bible and God's views of Israel, you constantly hear God refer to Israel as being adulterous and a prostitute. And you may wonder, is there ever any place in the Bible where that's really well defined? And what we're going to go through this morning is probably the place where you'll find that best defined. So let me spend a few minutes talking through what God is driving at here. First of all, if you look right into verse 5, it says, Oholah engaged in prostitution while she was still mine. Okay, so God is saying, Oholah, the northern kingdom, was mine. Oholah belonged to God. Now, Oholah was a woman, a female here. That's the way the allegory works. So what is that saying? That's essentially saying that there was a relationship that's akin to marriage, if you will, between Israel and God. And that relationship goes all the way back to the time of Abraham. And that relationship was particularly solidified at Mount Sinai. So Oholah, in effect, was God's wife. You see other places in the Bible where God refers to Israel as being his wife. By the way, we as Christians are referred to as being the bride of Christ. So it's kind of similar, but a little different concept. But Israel is frequently referred to as being God's wife in there. So she's his. She belongs to God. She is his wife. And it says that she engages in prostitution. So what is he talking about? So let's think about this in the way that a marriage works, okay? If one partner in a marriage is unfaithful and goes out and gets into adultery, into physical adultery, that is a betrayal of that marriage. And the relationship between God and Israel is a spiritual relationship. He is their God, and they are his people, and he expects them to remain faithful to him as their God. And if they, look at the first commandment, right? If they begin to move away from that and go worship other gods, that is a betrayal of God's marital relationship with Israel. Am I making sense here? God looks at that as being a betrayal of his marital relationship with Israel. They're his people, his chosen people, and they are choosing to go worship some other god. They did that at Mount Sinai with the golden calf right from the get-go, right? This has been going on a long time. So if they choose to go with another god, that's a betrayal. That betrayal, in essence, is adultery, right? It's akin to physical adultery in a marriage. Now, before I move on, let me just say that there's also physical adultery going on here as well. As we get into this, we're going to see that the women of Israel at that time were chasing after the men of Assyria. They were guys who looked like military heroes, wearing their, we just listened to the words of it, wearing their military outfits and driving chariots, and and the women were, whoa, this guy looks really great. So the women were chasing after these men and committing physical adultery with them as well. So that's going on here as well. But the main thing that God is focused on is the spiritual adultery that's going on, where his people, his woman, are chasing after the gods of Assyria. We're going to talk about that some more as we go through it. But during this period, Israel was drawing very close to Assyria, and by Israel I mean the northern kingdom was drawing very close to Assyria. And one of the things, in order to get Assyria's protection, they had to agree to take Assyria's gods. That was part of the deal. Assyria said, you want our protection? You want our army to come help you? We'll do that, but you've got to take our gods. So that meant that they now had to spiritually abandon God and go with the gods of Assyria. So this was all going on in here. So God looks at this and he says, this is adultery. This is, A, there's physical adultery, but B, this is spiritual adultery of this people. Now, if you take physical adultery and you put money into it, or favors, or sacrifices, or whatever, something where somebody gets something in return for physical adultery, that is what we call prostitution, right? That's a definition of prostitution. So why does God refer to Israel as being a prostitute here? Because she was getting something for this. What she was getting for this, what she was getting for adopting these gods from Assyria, was protection. Assyria was protecting Israel during that period. Assyria was the big power in the neighborhood. She really didn't need Assyria's protection. If she went to God, God would have given her the protection. We saw that back in David's time, right? But she didn't do that. She went to Assyria to be her protector, and Assyria protected her, sort of. And so Assyrian troops came in and protected her. And by the way, the main person she was being protected against was Judah. Different issue. So she was giving of herself to the gods of Assyria, and in return she was getting back protection. That is the definition of prostitution. So you see in this passage we're going to see today why God refers to Israel as being an adulterer and a prostitute during this period. Does that make sense? You see it all over the Bible. This is the best passage you're going to find in the Bible as to why. Why does God refer to Israel as being a prostitute and an adulteress? Questions on that? Okay, let me continue on. Another piece in here. It says that in verse 8 it says that the prostitution actually began in Egypt. This is the second time in the last couple of weeks we've seen that in here. You don't find that in the book of Exodus. That's an interesting point. The book of Exodus never says that when the Jews were in Egypt in slavery that they took on Egypt's gods. But here in Ezekiel we find that they did, that happened. That while apparently during the time before Moses, when they were in Egypt, during the time after Joseph died, they took on Egypt's gods. So this is not the first time Israel's gotten into adultery. Israel got into adultery as far back as when they were in slavery in Egypt. This is now twice in the last 3 weeks that we've seen that concept come up, that God is saying that Israel's adultery did not start here. It started way back in Egypt, back even before Moses. So that's an interesting thing. So Israel was adulterous even back then. Apparently, even then, Israel found the gods of Egypt to be very attractive to them. Even though they were in slavery, they found the gods of Egypt to be attractive to them back then. Then it goes on to say that the same Assyrians, the people that they are doing this adultery with right now, are going to turn on them. And they're going to come in and they're going to destroy them. And that did happen. In 721 BC, the Assyrians came in and destroyed the northern kingdom. They had had enough of them. The kings were playing around with other powers in the neighborhood, and the Assyrians finally said, that's it, we're done with you guys. And they came in and killed them and scattered the tribes, and there was no temple there, so there was very little worship of the real God still going on. And even to this day, they are referred to as the 10 lost tribes. The tribes that were in northern Israel, even to this day, are called the lost tribes because they really have never come back since then. God just destroyed them at that point. So before we move on to Oholiba, any questions about the northern kingdom and how this applies to the northern kingdom? Okay, let's move on to Oholiba next, which is the southern kingdom. And I'm going to look next at verses 11 through 21. Let me read this to you now. So remember, this is now the southern kingdom. This is Jerusalem that we're talking about now. Her sister Oholiba saw this. So she saw her sister being destroyed by her own prostitution, right? Her sister Oholiba saw this, yet in her lust and prostitution, she was more depraved than her sister. She too lusted after the Assyrians, governors and commanders, warriors in full dress, mounted horsemen, all handsome young men. I saw that she too defiled herself. Both of them went the same way. So the southern kingdom's doing the same thing the northern kingdom just did now. We're going to find out they did it even worse. But she carried her prostitution still further. She saw men portrayed on a wall, figures of Chaldeans portrayed in red. By the way, Chaldeans are Babylonians, which is another city up near Assyria. Where did I go? with belts around their waists and flowing turbans on their heads. All of them looked like Babylonian chariot officers, natives of Chaldea. As soon as she saw them, she lusted after them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. Then the Babylonians came to her to the bed of love, and in their lust they defiled her. After she had been defiled by them, she turned away from them in disgust. When she carried on her prostitution openly and exposed her naked body, I turned away, this would be God, I turned away from her in disgust, just as I had turned away from her sister. Yet she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. God's getting a little graphic here, right? So you longed for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosom was caressed and your young breasts were fondled. Okay. So God is, as you can tell, God's getting angrier and angrier. You can tell by the language, right? God is just getting angrier and angrier as he's going on through these chapters. And this is the angriest of all the chapters. You can just feel God's anger in here as he's saying this. But he's saying a number of things. First of all, Oholiba, the younger sister, Judah, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, was in prostitution as well during this period. She had, and she was even more depraved than her older sister, so she got even into it even worse than the northern kingdom did. She too was lusting after the Assyrians. So when the Assyrians were around, she was doing the same thing, right? She was getting the protection of the Assyrians, and in return, she was giving herself up spiritually to the gods of the Assyrians, and also her women were giving themselves up physically to the charioteers of the Assyrians, right? The officers, the military officers of the Assyrians. So both were happening at the same time. And this was all happening at the same time. The northern kingdom was falling apart at the seams as well. And it said she lusted after them. As soon as she saw them, she sent messengers to them in Chaldea. So, the women of Judah were falling in love with these charioteers. Now we talk about Chaldea is in here. Now at the same time, after Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom, Assyria began a slow descent, and at the same time Babylon began a slow rise. Now the two cities aren't that far apart. They're, less than 50 miles apart, I think, in what will be modern day Iraq. And so as Assyria starts going downhill, Babylon is going uphill. So Oholiba, Judah, is changing her affiliation from having Assyria protect her to having Babylon protect her. But she's doing the same stuff, right? She's still a prostitute to Babylon. So the Babylonians came to her to the bed of love, and in their lust they defiled her. So the Babylonians physically were involved with the women of Judah, and spiritually they required that if Judah was going to be protected by Babylon, then Judah had to accept the Babylonian gods. So Judah had to worship the Babylonian gods. So it was not only a physical adultery, but it was a spiritual adultery. It was not only, and it was for protection. So it was not only a physical prostitution, it was a spiritual prostitution that was going on here as well. This is later now than the northern kingdom, because the Babylonians are now involved. But it's the same thing happening, doing it the same way. It says, after she had been defiled by them, she turned away from them in disgust. So after a while, she said, what am I doing? And just got into disgust, but she kept doing it, right? When she carried on her prostitution openly and exposed her naked body, she turned away from them in disgust. Just as I had turned away from her sister. Yet she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth. Again, we go back to when she was a prostitute in Egypt. So again, now, this is the third time we hear that Israel prostituted herself to the gods of Egypt back when she was in slavery. Again, you don't see that anywhere in the book of Exodus. This is new news that we're getting here in Ezekiel, but we've seen it 3 times, so it's got to be true. And it's obviously coming from, these are God's actual words to Ezekiel, so we know that it's true. God is saying this. So we now know that Israel really began her flirtation with, with foreign gods, with pagan gods, back as far as when she was in slavery in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, and then it goes on about her lovers' genitals and all that. So you longed for the lewdness of your youth when in Egypt your bosom was caressed and your young breasts were fondled. So God is telling the story of how the southern kingdom got seduced by this whole thing as well. Now let me go on to verse, are any questions before we move on out of that? Let me move on now to verse 22. And, oh, by the way, actually, let me tell you, there are biblical references to what I'm talking about. The best biblical references are in. Let me go back to the northern kingdom for a minute. There are some nice biblical references to this in 2 Kings 15 through 19 and 2 Kings 17:3. Now again, this is the northern kingdom of Israel. Then Pul, this is on the second page of your handout now. Then Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land, and Menahem was the king at that point of the northern kingdom. Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his hold on the kingdom. So that's that first verse. That's 2 Kings 15:19. Now let's look at 2 Kings 17:3. This is a few years later. This is a different king of the northern kingdom, Hoshea. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. So at this point, Hoshea had already prostituted himself to Assyria. He had already become their vassal. In other words, a vassal is like a puppet, right? You know, I'll give you money to protect me, and you tell me what to do, and I'll do what you tell me. That's kind of a vassal relationship. So the northern kingdom had already become Assyria's vassal state at that point. Now let's look at what was going on in the southern kingdom. And this is also in 2 Kings. This is at the bottom of page 2 of your notes. This is 2 Kings chapter 16. And this is about King Ahaz. King Ahaz is the king of Judah, the southern kingdom. I'm going to go through verses 7 through 14. Listen to this. This is really incredible. King Ahaz of Judah did something even worse. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. And Ahaz took silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord. Let me read that again. Ahaz took silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasures of the royal palace, and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. Then King Ahaz went to Damascus and met with Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He saw an altar in Damascus and sent to Uriah the priest, this would be a priest back in Jerusalem now, sent to Uriah the priest a sketch of the altar with detailed plans of its construction. So Uriah the priest built an altar in accordance with all the plans that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus, and finished it before King Ahaz returned. When the king came back from Damascus, he saw the altar, he presented it, he approached it, and he presented offerings on it. Now Isaiah warned Ahaz of this in Isaiah 7:7-9. I'm not going to read that to you, but you can look it up if you want. Isaiah said, don't do this. Do not approach that altar and do not put offerings up on that altar. But Ahaz did it anyway. So you can see now that the southern kingdom's going the same way, right? The southern kingdom, this is as far back as Assyria, the southern kingdom took the gold and silver from the temple, from God's temple, and gave it up to pay as their price of prostitution, right? Gave it up to pay for protection money, for protection from the Assyrians. So the Assyrians said, yeah, you give us your gold and silver from God's temple and we'll protect you. And Ahaz did it. And then the king of Assyria said, okay, you're my vassal now, you belong to me, you're my puppet guy, so come on up here. So he came up to Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, and there's actually a black obelisk that has survived to this day that shows the picture of the king kneeling in front of the king of the king of Assyria at that time. And so we know that this actually did happen. Besides the fact that it's in the Bible, we know from physical evidence that this really did happen. And he gives the money to the king of Assyria. And when he's up there, he says, wow, that's a great looking altar you've got. I think I'd like one of those. And he makes the model of it, sends it back. They build an altar. He comes back and he worships those idols on that altar. So this is how bad things had gotten in the southern kingdom at this point. And this is actually quite early. This is before Babylon was even a big power yet. This is still back in the days of Assyria. You can see why God is really upset with that. So let me move on now to verses 22 through 27. Therefore, Oholiba, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will stir up your lovers against you, those who turned away from you in disgust, and I will bring them against you from every side. The Babylonians and all the Chaldeans, the men of Pekod and Shoa and Koa, and all the Assyrians with them, handsome young men, all of them, governors and commanders, chariot officers and men of high rank, all mounted on horses. They will come against you with weapons, chariots, wagons, with a throng of people. They will take up positions against you on every side with large and small shields and with helmets. I will turn you over to them for punishment, and they will punish you according to their standards. I will direct my jealous anger against you, and they will deal with you in fury. So God's making this happen behind the scenes, but they're the ones really executing it, right? They will cut off your noses and your ears, and those of you who are left will fall by the sword. They will take away your sons and daughters, and those of you who are left will be consumed by fire. They will also strip you of your clothes and take your fine jewelry. So I will put a stop to the lewdness and prostitution you began in Egypt. You will not look on these things with longing or remember Egypt anymore. So God is saying he's done, he's reached the point where the decision has been made. God has made the decision that he will destroy Jerusalem now, just like he destroyed the northern kingdom. And he's telling Jerusalem what's going to happen. He's saying they're all going to come and they're going to surround him, all these different nations. Babylon's going to be leading the charge, but there's going to be all these other people who are going to completely surround Jerusalem. They're going to put it into starvation, cut it off from water and food. They're going to be attacking it constantly. Meanwhile, all the people from Israel think they'll be safe behind the walls, so they all move into Jerusalem. And next thing you know, you've got way too many people behind these walls with not enough food and not enough water and not enough weapons, and they're trying to defend themselves and withstand a siege. And of course diseases break out, and so the people are dying from starvation, they're dying from disease, and eventually they're going to be dying by the sword when the Babylonians actually come through the walls. So that's what's happening here. And God says they will surround her on every side. All of these men will turn against her and come at her together. They will bring weapons and chariots and wagons and horses and many people. They will besiege Jerusalem from all sides with large shields and small shields. Then it goes on to say they'll be operating at God's command. So it's going to look like it's the Babylonians doing this, but really God is directing this behind the scenes. God is directing the Babylonians to do this. He's using them as his instrument. And God does this a lot in the Bible. He uses people, even evil people, even pagans, as his instrument to do things. He uses it in our world today. He uses evil people to do things today. We are being disciplined today in the world by evil people for things that we've done. Same thing. In many cultures in the ancient world, when a woman got involved in prostitution, she would have her nose cut off and her ears cut off. That was kind of a punishment in the Middle East. God is saying that's going to happen to you guys too, and apparently it did happen to some of the women in Jerusalem during that period. When the Babylonians come in, they're going to take away the children. So, nothing a woman values more than her children. She's going to lose those. The children will be taken away. They're going to set Jerusalem on fire, it says in here, and that did happen during the siege. The people are going to be stripped of their clothes, of their jewelry, everything they have that's of value to them, and ultimately they're going to be killed. So, and again it says, this is now the fourth time, that the idolatry goes all the way back to Egypt. So again, it's making very clear that this isn't something that just started after Solomon died. This inclination toward idolatry by the Jews went all the way back to Egypt, and God is going to get it out of them. That's going to happen when Jerusalem falls. They will never go into idolatry again. We're going to find that later as we get further. So it says in there that the Jewish people would never again worship idols as they once had. So once God finally destroys Jerusalem, after all of this, the siege, the disease, the starvation, killing people, taking away their children, taking their money, all of that, and taking a few of them into captivity, God makes it clear that the people that go into captivity will be the only part of Israel that's left. And for 70 years they'll be there. And even then, most of them will stay there. Only part of them will come back. And the ones that come back will be different. They will have learned the lesson. Stay away from idols, right? They will have learned the lesson. There's one true God, and we need to be true to him. And that's the lesson they'll learn. And when they come back, that will be part of Jewish culture. It is even to this day. We are now 2,600 years downstream from this. And the Jews are not out there worshiping idols today, and they never have since then. So the last time the Jews really got into idolatry was at this time here. They really did learn their lesson after God did what he's about to do to Jerusalem. So it really did work. God did it for a reason. Questions on it? We go on to verse 28 next, 28 through 35. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am about to deliver you into the hands of those you hate, to those you turned away from in disgust. They will deal with you in hatred and take away everything you have worked for. They will leave you stark naked, and the shame of your prostitution will be exposed. Your lewdness and promiscuity have brought this on you, because you lusted after the nations and defiled yourself with their idols. So that's the key, right? This is happening because you guys got into idolatry, right? You have gone the way of your sister, so I will put her cup into your hand. Then there's a poem that's in here. I guess if we were reading this in Hebrew, we might appreciate the poetry of this. I can't do that for you. This is what the sovereign Lord says. You will drink your sister's cup. So Oholiba will drink Ohola's cup. A cup large and deep. It will bring scorn and derision, for it holds so much. You will be filled with drunkenness and sorrow, the cup of ruin and desolation, the cup of your sister Samaria. You will drink it and drain it dry and chew on its pieces, and you will tear your breasts. I have spoken, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Since you have forgotten me and turned your back on me, you must bear the consequences of your lewdness and prostitution. So what God is saying here is, guys, you saw what I did to the northern kingdom, and you just kept right on doing this. You kept right on with all of this idolatry, all this sinning. You saw what I did to them. I'm going to do the same thing to you. You will drink every drop of the same cup that they drank, okay? Well, whatever punishment they got, you're going to get every ounce of it, every bit of it. It's all coming, and there's nothing you can do about it now. It's too late. So God is really just laying it out there for them that the same thing that happened up here is now about to happen here. It's almost exactly 5 years away that it will happen at that point. Questions on that one? Okay, let's move on to verses 36 through 44 now. The Lord said to me, Son of man, will you judge Ohola and Oholiba? Then confront them with their detestable practices, for they have committed adultery and blood is on their hands. So God is telling Ezekiel, tell this to the people. Okay, get this news out in front of the people. They committed adultery with their idols. They even sacrificed their children. That's another horrible sin to God, is sacrificing your children to idols. But let's catch this next part. This is something we hadn't heard yet. They committed adultery with their idols. They even sacrificed their children, whom they bore to me as food for them, food for the idols. They have also done this to me. Now, it gets even worse. At that same time, they defiled my sanctuary, that would be the sanctuary in the temple in Jerusalem, and desecrated my Sabbaths. On the very day they sacrificed their children to their idols, they entered my sanctuary and desecrated it. This is what they did in my house. So they actually killed their children in God's temple, sacrificed them to their idols, fed the meat of the bodies on the altar to their idols, and did it on the Sabbath. That's what God is saying here. Is that incredible? I mean, just absolutely incredible. That's what they were doing. That's how bad it was at that time. They were doing these things on Sabbaths. Let me continue on. They even sent messengers for men who came from far away, and when they arrived, you bathed yourself for them, applied eye makeup, and put on your jewelry. This is the Babylonians now. You sat on an elegant couch and set a table spread before it, on which you had placed the incense and olive oil that belonged to me. So we're talking here about the physical act of adultery, and we're also talking about the spiritual act of adultery with the Babylonians. The noise of a carefree crowd was around her. So they're doing this in a party atmosphere, right? Drunkards were brought from the desert, along with men from the rabble, and they put bracelets on the wrists of the woman and her sister, and beautiful crowns on their heads. So the sexual promiscuity that was going on was just ridiculous in this. It was almost an orgy kind of situation that was going on in Jerusalem. Then I said about the one worn out by adultery, now let them use her as a prostitute, for that is all she is. And they slept with her as men sleep with a prostitute, so they slept with those lewd women, Oholah and Oholiba. But righteous judges will sentence them to the punishment of women who commit adultery and shed blood, because they are adulterous and blood is on their hands. So God is saying, Judah, this is about to happen to you now. Same thing that happened to Oholah is going to happen to Oholiba. And it is so bad that God is going to execute judgment, and he's going to use those people that you are bringing in, having these orgies with, these physical orgies with. He's going to use those people, the Babylonians, to come and destroy you. That's how bad it's going to be, and they will hate you. And as God says, it's the punishment of women who commit adultery and shed blood. Now, in ancient Israel, if you were a woman who committed adultery, you were stoned. I mean, it was a death thing. Sorry, ladies, that's what was happening back then. So this is exactly what was expected in that society at that point in time. So the common soldiers of the Babylonian army and the common people living around in the desert that weren't Jews would act as the judges of these prostitutes. That's what God's saying here. Now let me go on to verse 46 through 48, or 46 through 49. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Bring a mob against them and give them over to terror and plunder. The mob will stone them and cut them down with their swords. They will kill their sons and daughters and burn down their houses. So I will put an end to lewdness in the land, that all women may take warning and not imitate you. You will suffer the penalty for your lewdness and bear the consequences of your sins of idolatry. Then you will know that I am the sovereign Lord. So God is saying, all this punishment is coming. It is just. It is just. You may wonder about the Babylonians doing it. Yeah, the Babylonians are not just people, but they're acting justly because God am authorizing them to come in and do it. God is authorizing the Babylonians to come in and do this. So it is justice, it is just, and it is proper. It is exactly what should be happening. And they will come in, they will punish her. There are going to be mobs of people in Jerusalem with swords killing people. The streets will be filled with terror, right? I mean, imagine that. They finally have to deal with the consequences of their actions. They're going to feel completely plundered, completely violated. And the Lord tells them they're going to suffer for their sins. But those who remain faithful will be rewarded in the end. So there will still be some people who will get out, and they will get out at the very end, and they will say, okay, take me into exile, I surrender, take me into exile. And they'll leave the city, and they will not be killed. And they will eventually go into exile in Babylon, where Ezekiel is, and where Ezekiel and Daniel will be leading them. And eventually they will come out of it. Some of them will come out of exile 70 years later and will come back and reestablish Jerusalem and rebuild God's temple. And those people will never get into idolatry again. So God is accomplishing his purpose here. It's a tough way to do it. But then again, these guys have been into some tough sin for a long time. So that brings us to the conclusion of the first half of Ezekiel now. Any questions on this before I move on?
So this event and this vision he's having was in 591 BC.
Yes.
And the actual Babylonian captivity of Israel or Judah was yet to come.
Sort of.
So most of this story is history, and in this history, reminding them of what happened to Israel itself. So now we're into what's going to happen to you.
Yes. Yes. The captivity in Babylon actually happened in 3 phases. I've gone through that with you before. The third and final phase hasn't happened yet at this point. The first 2 phases have happened. Those are over. Remember, Daniel went in the first phase to Jerusalem. He was the leader of the first phase people. Ezekiel went in the second phase to Babylon. So he was the leader of the second group. The third group will not go until Jerusalem actually falls in 586 BC. So that's 5 years in the future. So God's talking here about how horrible it's going to be 5 years in the future, but how well-deserved it is.
Okay, that's why you kept saying 5 years, 591 to 586.
Yeah, it's not an accident that, and none of these dates in the Bible are an accident. Whenever you see some date in the, on the 8th day of the 7th month of whatever this happened, whenever you see that, pay attention to it, because God is sending us a message. And what he's saying to here is, this day that this happened on, which is August 9th, 591 BC, that Ezekiel's sitting in front of this group of people and talking about this, is 1 day less than 5 years from the exact day when Jerusalem will fall. This is on the 10th of Av in 591 BC. On the 9th of Av in 586 BC, Jerusalem actually does fall, and all of this happens. So it's exactly 1 day inside that 5-year window. So he's saying, guys, within 5 years, this is going to happen. Okay? Other questions?
But some of it had already happened.
Some of it had already happened, yeah. At this point, they hadn't been surrounded yet by the Babylonians. We're going to see that. That's going to start to happen next week. We're going to start to see that happen. We'll start to see Jerusalem actually surrounded by the Babylonians. That hadn't happened yet. At this point, the Babylonians haven't come yet. They're getting ready to come. They're really upset with Judah, but they haven't actually gotten there yet. Other questions? Yeah, I'm getting the hook in the back. Yeah, so next week we're going to move into the second half of Ezekiel. We're going to see the next vision that Ezekiel has, the 4th vision, which is several years later now, and it's actually on the day that they begin the siege of Jerusalem. So it will be in 588 BC is next week's class. Now, bear in mind, Ezekiel's putting this out there still in his time. Ezekiel's putting this out there in 588 BC, but he's looking forward to a time that's yet to come at that point. So we'll see that next week. And any other questions for you? Well, for those of you at home, thank you for joining us today, and we wish you all a good day in the Lord, a good Sabbath day, and we pray you're all blessed this week. Thank you.